But what inspired me was a desire to serve, seeing God in man. And for Modi, what I discovered is that as a young child, it's a very, very small incident which is not in the public domain, only first time in my book has brought it out. The beauty in which adaptive leadership emerges, how stakeholder consultations happen, how the work at the center was focused, what was the mandate that was given. It is not about repealing Article 370, it is an instrument.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Alchemy of Transformation, where we go into the essence of things and how do you bring about real and meaningful change. Transformation is the essence of life. Everything is in a state of evolution. Everything is growing, or if you don't grow, then you die. So that's why the transformation, both of the self, individuals, of organizations, and of countries, is of immense importance to this podcast. Today, I have someone I would be very proud to say has worked on transformation of the self, transformation of organizations, transformation of communities, and now in essence working on transformation of India, which is an expanding power. So by that essence, it would be transforming the world. I have a friend with whom I have been in classrooms at the Harvard Kennedy School. So we have a personal context, and I have some background to him. We're very pleased to have Dr. Balu, also Dr. Balasubramaniam, who is a thinker, also a doer, someone who has got grassroots experience. He is a doctor from Mysore. Of course, Mysore is very famous for Tipu Sultan and the war that happened with the British and the Indians at that time. He was a graduate of the Mysore Medical School, and then at the age of 19, he set up a youth movement called the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, where they have impacted 3 million people through 40 projects. We'll hear a lot more about this gentleman, Vivekananda, and his role and history, both in last century, but also now in India and Indian politics. He is also the founder of GRAM, which is the Grassroots Research and Advocacy Movement, which is all about community engagement, public advocacy, public policy engagement, research and impact evaluation, public policy and impact evaluation. He has been a Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor at Cornell University between 2012 2014. He was a fellow student at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he was a Mason Fellow. And now, currently, he's a full-time member of the Prime Minister's HR Capacity Building Commission of India, where he's looking at civil services reform. He's the author of 5 books, so very busy man. One of them, the latest one, we're going to talk a lot about, but he has been in the history. He has written from grassroots, Voices from the Grassroots, I, the Citizen, and about, again, Swami Vivekananda as I see him. The 4 books that he wrote before the current one, which is the topic of discussion, which is The Power Within, about PM Narendra Modi and his success and his life. So very welcome, Dr. Balu, to Alchemy of Transformation Podcast.
Thank you, Jalal, for having me here, and such a pleasure to reconnect. And though it's virtual, it's nice to see you on the screen.
Absolutely. And, we've shared time in Kennedy School in Boston, which is a great opportunity for meet people like Dr. Balu, because you are a student, you're exploring different ideas, meeting people from different backgrounds. So it's great to have you back on this podcast, Dr. Balu. And this book is of immense importance to Pakistan, because the immense importance of the person that we have, also some controversy, especially in some of the neighbors, including Pakistan. So will be very interesting to decipher the person, the enigma, the vision that is PM Narendra Modi. But tell us firstly about yourself. Who are you? What did you, how did you get to do all of these things, and how did you get to be here?
Wow, that's going to be a long answer for you. Once you think about life and the way life takes you, mine, it all started with possibly an incident which was not positive, if I can say that. And whether it's India or Pakistan, all of us from a typical middle class families, the only aspirations that parents have of the children are you do your medicine or you do your engineering. And those days, especially during my 40, I'm talking about more than 40 years ago, parents only thought that either become an engineer, become a doctor, and go abroad. And that's it. That's how it was. And my entire family is abroad. So that way it made sense for my father to imagine I would also go abroad. And here I was wanting to get into the Indian Institute of Technology, which is India's premier technology institution, what we call the IIT. I didn't qualify. So it was, I just felt very disappointed. But no, we didn't have the entrance exams that you have today, the standardized test to take students of professional education. So you just went with your 12th grade marks. And I had very high marks. I had 99.67% in my what we call the physics, chemistry, maths, which is basic for engineering studies. So I applied to another equally good school. Today they call the National Institute of Engineering, but those days they were called the regional engineering colleges. They were considered to be one step lower than the IITs. And that's just then was computer sciences coming in. So everybody was talking of computers. We all imagine them to be big boxes in large rooms. So the excitement of young people wanting to get into this space was just starting. And we didn't even have, I don't think we even had the Infosys and the Wipros of the world at that time. So I was really enamored by it. I thought I'll get qualify for it, but I didn't because, I'm not sure if that exists in Pakistan, but in India, there's a very strong affirmative action. And so in that process, what we are all considered as general merit, I didn't qualify because there's only one seat and the guy who got 100% got it. So very disappointed. I just joined some engineering school in my town of Bengaluru. I come from Bangalore, which is now known as Bengaluru, the IT capital of India, and went to an engineering school. And the first day, today India has got an anti-ragging law. But during my student days, there's no anti-ragging law, and in what typically in the US is known as hazing. And so I just went to school and was very badly ragged the first day. Didn't have the courage to go back to school the next day. But coming from again a very typical ordinary middle class family, my mother homemaker, very conscious of education, she wouldn't let you stay at home, and you didn't have enough money to go sit in a movie theater. So what do? You just go to a place which doesn't charge you any money. And I found just beside my engineering school was the Ramakrishna Ashram. An ashram is a holy place, like which was founded by Swami Vivekananda that you spoke about in the late 1890s. So what happened was I just went there and spent some time, and I think the monks there must have thought that this guy is just a vagabond wandering around, and they were concerned. And so I thought to show that I'm very serious, I used to go sit in the library. And the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, that the photograph that you saw behind me, he was somebody who took the Indian thinking and concepts to the West, and he was very popular for his Chicago address. And this was undivided India at those days. I'm talking of 1890s. So he was somebody who all his works were in 8 volumes. Two small books changed my life. One was called To the Youth of India, and the other was called His Call to the Nation, where he called young Indians. He said that if you're educated at people's expense, you should be called a traitor if you don't work for their welfare. He said, I call every young man a traitor who, having been educated at people's expense, cannot pay the least heed to them. And then another powerful statement, I always believe at 16, 17, everybody is a communist or socialist. We all believe that you have a magic wand, the world will be a beautiful place, peace will be there everywhere, everybody will be equal. And at that age, when you read Vivekananda, and one of the other statements he said was, I do not believe in a God or religion. And this is a religious figure telling this. I do not believe in a God or religion which cannot wipe away the widow's tears. And in the undivided India, how widows were treated, right? And so they were not allowed to come out of the homes, etc. And he was a social reformer. So he said, I do not believe in a God or religion which cannot wipe away the widow's tears or bring a piece of bread to the orphan's mouth. So he said, religion is about seeing God in man. And I think possibly all religions say the same thing in different ways, but we don't live it. And so when he gave this call, I felt that, wow, this is the religion I want to practice. This is the God I want to know. And coincidentally, the same day I felt this powerful feeling, I want to serve my motherland and I want to serve God in man. Those days we had telegrams. I don't even know today's generation knows what a telegram is, right? They would say, is it a WhatsApp message? Is it an email? And so saying, join Mysore Medical College. So I thought it's a divine sign, a hand of God asking me to do medicine, though I didn't want to be a doctor. So that was 1982, 42 years ago. And in 1984, I just couldn't sit back. As a young third year student, I thought I must do something right away. That's how since the inspiration came from Swami Vivekananda and his teachings, and I wanted this to be a generational movement of young people who actually will be concerned and bring these values. And I'm sure Pakistan is very alike to India, and for us also, rural India gets less of doctors. Even today, 80% of doctors practice in urban India, and rural India hardly has got physicians. So I thought I must actually set up a hospital which will work for rural people with a very cost-effective healthcare that I should bring in. Few years down the line, I realized health is not what people need. People are worried about their next meal, and I went into the forest. So I was living with indigenous tribal communities who suffer a lot because of development. In that area, 4 reservoirs were built. And those days, there was no rehabilitation laws in place, and the whole forest was a national park. And people who were living in the forest for centuries were actually brought out saying that you're now not allowed to stay there. So my view was that this is not fair. So when I thought, how do these things happen? And so I started working in education. So build schools. After I built the hospital, I built schools and colleges in the forest for indigenous communities. And I thought they need food, and so I started doing livelihood activities. So, but do all this, and these are my children that you see on the screen. And so to do all this, I had to actually. I thought that I need more qualification. My knowledge is not enough. So we all believe universities can give you that education, but today I believe life is the best university you can live in. But then those days I was different. So I went and did my public health program. I went and did my MPhil in systems management and hospital administration. I thought I can figure it out. Then I thought, okay, I haven't figured it out enough. Let me go to the mecca of policy making. But that decision I took because I felt that it's not the people. It's just the policy maker who doesn't spend time in communities and who doesn't understand the voice of the people, doesn't listen to them, sitting in Islamabad or in Delhi, they decide what people need and people want, and they decide the programs. So I felt, why can't people spend more time? So that was when I was troubled, and I felt that policy making cannot be done by people who don't understand people and the connectedness to the masses. So that I thought, let me learn properly how to do this. That's why I came to Kennedy School, and that was much later in life. But then, like I used to live with them, amongst them. It was the best years of my life. I lived for 26 years in those spaces. So after Kennedy School, I realized that Kennedy School possibly taught me a lot. It gave me a lot of knowledge, but it never really answered the questions I was struggling with. Because even there, it was very highly centralized policy making, economic drivers driving the whole thinking. But community respect for the whole world somehow imagines poor people as ignorant people. We say poverty means ignorance. We never understand that just because they don't have schooling doesn't mean they don't have knowledge. And I learned a lot from my tribal traditional chieftains and the women that you see in this picture and the interactions I had with the Zen people. So I decided that, I need to get these voices in. And the frustrations of my thoughts at that time led me to write those books. I, the Citizen, Voices on the Grassroots. They all now are globally acclaimed, but those days I felt that, somebody has to tell this story. But then what the troubling thought was, most of us, especially those of us from colonized countries, and we were just talking about it a few minutes ago, are left with this burden of belief that we are not good enough and these guys have to tell us how to live our lives. But actually, we have a rich cultural and civilizational heritage, whether it's Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. We all are endowed with this enormous knowledge, but we don't respect it ourselves. So I felt that I got to go deep into it. Either we romanticize and say everything in the past was great, which is not, or we just say that everything is nothing is good enough. So I felt that a nation cannot understand and appreciate its past can never build a great future. So I decided to study the past, get into civilizational thinking, started studying the Indian scriptures, the Indian wisdom, the Indian knowledge systems. And then I realized there's so much of leadership in this. What we can dismiss off as religious texts, which actually they're not, whether it's the Mahabharata, whether it's the Ramayana, whether it's the Panchatantra or the Jataka tales. Many of us grow up on Tom and Jerry cartoons, but we don't read the Jataka tales, which are just historical stories of teaching us moral science in its own way. So I realized that can I do research? Can I pick this up? Can I capture it? And can I understand leadership through this lens? And that's how I started working on leadership. And I'll probably stop here and then carry on as we go on. But what inspired me was a desire to serve, seeing God in man. And that that changed my life forever.
And you talked about going to Kennedy School and not having some of the going there, a lot of aspiration, hopes, but not finding some of the solution. But I did realize that you did use a term called work in the center, and I think we know where that comes from. But this concept of local wisdom, which definitely in the colonial system or in a world where the donor, so we say the giving hand is better than the receiving hand. So technically that means is that you're more intelligent, you're better. But that doesn't see the receiving hand as being a resourceful means to achieve its own aspiration or to find its own solution. So when you are working and living in the with the tribals, what elements of how did you find them to be much more resourceful and much more problem solving than you had imagined? And in a sense, the concept of God within is that how did you find it within those tribals that people see that as very basic, very simple people?
I think it's a great question, and I would like to narrate two stories, two real life experiences. I would call them, not stories. There was a chieftain. He was called, and these are traditional chieftains of tribal communities. His name was Kempaya. He belonged to an anthropological tribe called Kadu Kurubas. Kadu Kuruba just means indigenous community from the forest. Kadu is forest in the local language. And so he had become a very good mentor, friend, colleague in my journey there. And I was very bothered because the place where I lived in is Asia's largest elephant corridor. And it's a Project Tiger area. So elephants just every evening they would come out and graze whatever farmers grew. I used to be very angry that whatever little agriculture interventions we do, the elephants come and eat. We're actually feeding them more in an organized way, that's all. But people were not getting the food. So I was talking to him, and then we decided we should grow a crop that the elephants don't know anything about. So what in the local languages they call foreign vegetables. So we zeroed in on cabbage because cabbage is not a traditional Indian vegetable and it is imported vegetable for us. And the elephants didn't know that crop. And so we decided we'll grow cabbages. So we had a bumper crop because elephants didn't destroy them that year. They later on learned to destroy it the subsequent years. So we had a bumper crop. We were thrilled that now tribals have a lot of money in their hands. So I still remember my colleague, we loaded that truck into it. He drove the truck down to the local market, which is 80 kilometers away in the city of Mysore. And the market, I had actually inquired the price the previous day was 6 rupees a kilo. So I thought, wow, a bonanza for tribals. I'm talking of 35 years ago. But those guys offered me 30 paise. And it's a mafia. The entire markets are controlled by rich traders who run a mafia. And I'm sure the situation would be the same in Pakistan
We
too.
call,
Because
we call them RPs. We call them RPs here, which are the money lenders, the
yeah.
intermediaries. The huge margins they make, yes.
And so they offered 30 paise to a kilogram. So I said, nonsense. And my indigenous tribal friend said, I said, we'll just dump it on the roadside and come back. And they said, no, let's distribute it to some orphanage, some old age home. It'll do some good and come back. But finally, we decided to sell it at 30 paise because we had to cover a fuel cost. So we came back. I was very disappointed, very frustrated and depressed. And Kempaya came down to see me. Every evening we would sit together and chat. And he said, why are you looking so off? I said, this is what happened. I thought I can eliminate poverty for tribals, but I think I lost the game. And he laughed at me and said, how stupid can you be? Why are you measuring everything by money? And he said it so beautifully. You city people only understand money. You don't understand life. And I said, come on, you can't just make a statement like that. You got to explain this. And then he told me something. He said, you could never see what actually happened. You threw a seed into the soil and magic happens. That is the hand of God. No, you can explain it by science, but look at how the way God expressed himself. From a seed, he becomes a vegetable which you can eat and sustain and gives you life. You see money, I see life in the hand of God, he said. Now, the Bhagavad Gita of the Hindu scripture talks of God in the same way. It just says, no, we don't have to see, and I'm sure the Quran would say the same thing. We don't have to see God standing there ahead of us. No, God is there in so many ways for us, each one of us. We can relate to him in that space. But what the tribal told me was a real lesson for me. And the same Kadakurba Ejamana, we call him Ejamana as a chieftain. In another instance, they would have agriculture. In the tribal community, the chieftain has to give the first seed for the tribals to actually sow during agriculture season. If he doesn't give you seeds, which means you're barred from agriculture that year. So but during the agriculture season, I was standing with him. He was distributing seeds. He gave paddy to somebody. He gave millets to somebody else. He gave pulses to somebody else. And somebody else he said, no seeds for you this year. And I told Kempaiah, you can't be so stupid. How can you let land fallow? Our countries don't have enough food and there are too many people. We have to feed them. And he was very, it was, he said, you'll never understand. Come back after the harvest. So I went after the harvest. In the central part of the village, they call it Chowdi. There's a central, the place where justice is given out by him. He sat there and he was distributing it. And he said, okay, how many people live in your house? And somebody would say 4 people. You would say, okay, keep 10 quintals of ragi, the millet, the rest you give to me. So he would equitably distribute, and even the fellow who didn't cultivate would get something. And I asked him how. He didn't do anything. He said, no, he's done a lot. He actually worked in somebody else's land, got money, and so he has to be given. So by the end of the 2-3 hours, the entire community actually had everything everybody grew. And what he would give you this year, he won't give you next year. So crop rotation was happening. And I asked him, what about the land that is fallow? How can you not grow something? And he said, no, what do you mean we didn't grow something? We allowed God to grow weeds and insects, and soil has to grow back. So soil has to get its life. And we talk of sustainable development, and this man lived sustainable development. That's when I thought community wisdom is so strong. And what are we talking? I am going and talking to them about sustainable development. He said the insects have to live, the spiders have to live. Biodiversity is what we're talking today, and he lived biodiversity. And land was not fallow. It was actually what you and I see as weeds, he saw as biodiversity. And I think this is the kind of wisdom the world misses. University educations gives competence or a impression of competence or a pretension of competence. But what it robs away is the community wisdom that we should respect and cherish. Because we don't look back at our own selves, our own countries, and the wisdom in our countries and respect it for what it is worth. I'm not saying we should accept everything that they say. We got to validate it. But once validated, we should have the pride to say, this is mine and my country's has got this knowledge. So the cultural sensitivity we need, I call it knowledge is contextually relevant. Something 300 years ago does not have to be relevant today. We have to discard it. And knowledge which is culturally appropriate. What is appropriate for India and its culture may not be appropriate for Pakistan. What is appropriate for Bangladesh may not be appropriate for the United States. So we need to understand that knowledge has to be culturally appropriate. Any intervention has to be culturally appropriate. They have to be contextually relevant. And it is these tribals who taught me that.
And it's fascinating that you said biodiversity or inclusivity in a way. That's what they were practicing.
Huh? Equity. Today's world is troubled by inequities. And here was a classical example of equity.
Absolutely. And now development is going in that direction. They were coming with solutions. And now they're saying lead with a question. That's how they don't assume anything, which the tribals being respectful of others, being humble, grounded, were already practicing. So tell me, once you went with that kind of knowledge and wisdom, and then you went to the icons of Western education, Harvard and Cornell, how was the adjustment to that, where people think that they have the solutions? Well, you're coming from a culture where you have a bit more inclusive and holistic view of how systems work. And did you did that get you more into training and book writing so that you can give away that knowledge? And how did you cope with some of the Western arrogance that is always there, that we know better than you how to solve your problems?
For me, when I went there, I actually thought that I could discover solutions, because that's the impression we all go with, right? And it's a mecca of learning, and we could possibly get to learn so much. I'm not saying it's not there. It's in a context, and that context may not be applicable to our situations, but there are certain principles which all nations possibly have, and its general principles could apply to every one of us. But the way the principles gets applied needs to be seen in a particular context. What I realized was the West is very comfortable not in contextualizing knowledge, but in homogenizing the environment so the knowledge fits in. And that is why their idea of democracy has to be everywhere. It's not possibly our countries are very like India was so democratic in its villages. The village councils ran the village, and then they had representatives, and even when the kings were ruling, it was very democratized. But they don't see it as democracy. Democracy must be only in their way of executive presidency or a Westminster form of government. So China has a Mandarin system for centuries, right, of bureaucracy, but we never see it as a democratization. Maybe there was a capture of power. I'm not saying it was not there, but there's still a decentralization that was existing in all our countries and cultures. But for them, what I realized was their inability to possibly articulate and learn from other contexts and see if it applies or not makes them cynical of the other country's context and says that you're wrong and therefore you have to take my context too, not just my solutions, but the context in which the problems are being discovered. And many of us imitated, right? And that's what colonization did to all of us. The reason why you saw in one of the pictures I was wearing a white dhoti. Now, the reason why you wear a white dhoti is because I live in temperatures of 40 degree plus, Celsius plus. I need aeration, I need light to be reflected off, I need to be comfortable. But if I have to wear a black trousers and a coat and a tie, which I would like to imitate and say that is a formal dress, who decides formality? The West narrates formality. Who decides what is human rights? The West decides what's human rights. Who decides what is fair trade? The West decides the definitions. But we lived with all these principles and we never really think as important. So I believe, well, I'm not saying they're wrong, but their knowledge is inadequate to explain what we are. And therefore, because they can't explain us, they call us wrong. And that's the easy way out. So I realized that, well, I got a lot, but I at least got the appreciation that their knowledge is inadequate. And that's why when I went to Cornell, I proudly say I took my knowledge, my wisdom, designed a course on leadership which is embedded with all this cultural context, this knowledge and strength, combined it with the adaptive knowledge I learned from people like Ronald Heifetz and others. It's also great knowledge. I'm not discarding the knowledge, but synthesizing what I knew with what is available and contextualizing it in a global context. Even in this book, Power Within, that's the solution I present. The epilogue of the book, I call it the Dharma of Legacy and the Legacy of Dharma. I actually compare three global leaders: Abraham Lincoln, who shifted his country's trajectory, Lee Kuan Yew, who shifted Singapore's trajectory, and Deng Xiaoping, who shifted Chinese civilizational trajectory. And I say, why is this model that I'm describing and what Narendra Modi personifies today is an answer to the world? In the G20 meeting in Delhi declaration, the Honorable Prime Minister said the world needs the four P's. He said we need profits. You can't say you can run your country on an empty stomach. You need economy. And every country needs it. Pakistan needs it. Sri Lanka needs it. India needs it. Every country needs it. He also said, but you need people. You got to invest on human capital. You got to invest in everybody and listen to them. Third, he said we need the planet. Without the planet, there's no we at all, right? And how do we have to balance economy with ecology? And the last point, which is what is music to my ears, was we need peace. No, without peace, there'll continue to be poverty. So all these four P's and how do you do that is what I've described in a very practical way. And if you look at governance in India today, despite the colonization, he gave a call called the Panch Pran, the five life elements he gave, apart from the ecology and all that. One concept he said was decolonize our thinking. We have so our DNA has become colonized. And he said we need to have pride in ourselves. We need to have pride in our cultures, in our narratives, in our own strength. That's why when you told about how well you do this podcast, story of the self, the story of the other, I think it is so important because the story of the self embedded in the story of the other in each of our countries and civilizations is what gives us the strength. And if you can't see that story, you don't create the public narrative that will be contextually relevant. And to create that, you need to understand this. So he talks of Jan Bhagidari, which in Hindi also and Urdu will be the same thing. He talking about partnership state. We spoke of the civil services. Both our countries were, unfortunately, the legacy of the British was our civil services, right? And and so when we got our freedoms in India, I can talk more authoritatively about India. In 1947, we had 2% of global GDP. And remember, we had for 1600 continuous years. Angus Madison's History of the World Economy, he's evidentially captured, and that was unified India, which means all of us together had 38% of the global economy. We were the only country, the larger country, which grew continuously for 1600 years. The British decimated us, whether the effect of colonization or whatever it was. When we got freedom, India's share of the global GDP was 2%. The share of world trade was 0.5%. And we were led to believe we are not capable, we are inferior. We missed the entire industrial revolution. A country, a civilization which discovered the binary system. Today's computers and artificial intelligence functions on that, which gave trigonometry, algebra, calculus to the world, could not even have half percent of trade at 1947. So the state had to be a providing state. Poverty was so much, illiteracy was so much. The state had to provide. All our countries went through this challenge. 90s, India jumped ahead and said we have to deregulate. The government is controlling too much. We need to privatize. We need to join the global economy. We need to globalize. And a lot of shift happened. And from a providing state, we became a provisioning state. We said we'll provision and facilitate other sectors to come in. Today, the Prime Minister has given a call for a partnership state. And remember, states thrive on asymmetry of information and power. The less citizens know, the better for the state. And if you say partnership, you're giving a call for breaking asymmetries of information, which means you're breaking asymmetries of power. So my responsibility today is to enable the civil services, build their capacity to make them citizen-centric and respect citizens as equal. So all that I lived all my life and try to talk and write about is what I'm doing today, and that's great joy for me. But the reason for the books were I didn't have this position that time, 30, 40 years ago. Today I'm in a place where I can do and contribute stuff and knowledge. Those days I could only grow more and more frustrated. I'm seeing results, I'm running those experiments, but nobody is listening to me. How do I get people to listen? And that is when I actually wrote the book. In the preface to my book, I the Citizen, I say, I'm not writing for others to read my book. I'm writing to preserve my own sanity. And that's how it started. That became a very popular book. Cornell University Press republished it. It became a global textbook on development and policy. And then I thought, okay, now how do I get people to hear this? So I wrote Voices from the Grassroots, where I said common people's voices, how do I take it to the state? I recognize that there is hunger, but it's not enough. A book is only a book for them. That's when I started the policy think tank, which does community-based research, collects evidential information or evidence on the ground, presents it to the community, to the policy maker in a very evidential way, and says, listen, your policy is doing good or not doing good or could do better. This is how it's impacting citizens. This is what the citizens think of it. What can you do? And that policy think tank is very popular today. It does a lot of research for government, a lot of evaluation. That's GRAM. So to me, wherever the state concede, it doesn't have answers to all the people's problems. Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar have to come together. I was not like that. I thought the government is mediocre, inefficient, and I, as a civil society organization, can replace the government. I can supplant it completely. Today, I say it is wrong. At best, I can supplement it. I thought all the private sectors are only crooks making money, no sympathy, no heart at all, no empathy for people. Today, I understand that compassionate capitalism can be a reality. So, unless we bring the strengths and synergistic partnerships between the state, private sector, civil society, and citizens, and recognize and work with each other's strengths. So 30 years ago, I was a confrontational advocate. Today, I'm a collaborative advocate. I say, let's work together with each other's strengths, because if we don't come together, we can't find solutions to the complex problem the world is facing today.
What a fascinating journey. And the term Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, I think that encompasses a holistic economic model. How can government be a partner? Markets are very important. One of the reasons why most economies don't develop is because, we think that there is a central bureaucratic solution to solving a market failure problem. ये हमारा IAS में भी बहुत था. And it's also very much in the Pakistan civil service. Somehow some bureaucrat can solve a market failure coordination through creating a
Who will
bureaucratic
solve the
process.
state failure problem, right? We don't see state
Yeah.
failure. We easily think of market failures, but states can also fail. And who's going to solve the state failure problem?
Who's got to solve it? Exactly. But the interesting thing you talked about is the knowledge and what they appreciate, and that they appreciate standardization and replicable. And that's, I think, the basis of industrialization of the Western society and growth is the replicable and cookie cutter approach. I was thinking about what you were saying here. That's what they value, and that's why they want the same thing. Is a great Western institution called McKinsey. because McKinsey consultants, whether they're from India or from Pakistan or from China or from USA, are trained to produce this analysis in a specific way. And the inner creativity is actually not encouraged. As far as I've known, that the whole idea is that you can pull a person from anywhere in the world and he will look and analyze and try to solve the problem the same way. So that homogeneity, that standardization, I thought that was very interesting as an example, McKinsey, but also in other corporates, which has been very successful, but it takes away creativity, it creates away individualism, and some of the grassroots solutions that are there.
And that's absolutely true, because I'll give another wonderful example that happened to me in my life. The beginning of my career, I was like this McKinsey consultant. The standard cookie cutter solution that medical schools taught me. And WHO had actually, when I was studying, had called the oral rehydration salt therapy as the discovery of the century, to that extent. Science calling it the discovery of the century. I was trained in that. And they told us, when you go into a village, either you give these packets, oral rehydration packets, which I think a field worker in Pakistan or in India would do the same thing, or you teach people how to make home available fluids. You ask them to boil a liter of water, cool it down, add a pinch of salt into it, add a fistful of sugar, and then mix it up well and ask the child to drink it. It should taste like your tears. If it tastes like your tears, the electrolyte composition is perfect. Make the child drink it. I believed in it. I thought this is going to save lives. And here I was in a tribal community talking to women, and I asked, anybody sick here? And they said, my baby is sick. I said, come bring it on. And I downloaded all my knowledge of home available fluid. And I said, 1 liter. And that woman looked at me and said, how much is 1 liter? Now, how do you explain to a tribal woman from the forest a metric which the West decided? Whereas she knows in what in local language of Ser and Pow, and she's got a metric of her own. Just because I didn't learn that metric, I have to make her call her ignorant and say, you don't know what a liter is. And how do you tell a woman who walks 5 kilometers a day to get water to discard water in the evening, that boiled and cooled water? She has to collect firewood from the forest, boil the water on that, and then you want her to discard it. It's blasphemy to tell her that. And then and a child with 6 month or 1 year old child, which is having, let's say it's having a diarrheal attack, and you ask them to feed this fluid which takes like your tears, even if you force feed it, the child will start vomiting because that's how bad it tastes. So somehow there's some microsecond of humility in me at that time. I asked her, I just thought about it in my mind. This is an anthropological community with a 10,000-year history. They must have had diarrheas, all their history full of diarrheas. People must have died, people have survived. So I thought, let me ask her. And I asked this young 25-year-old mother, what do you do when you have diarrhea? And what she told me was something fascinating. She said, I just go to the neighboring petty shop, and the 50 paise, I buy 2 bananas. Those days you would get 2 bananas for 50 paise. The remaining 50 paise, I would buy flattened rice, what we call poha here. I don't know what's the Urdu word for it, but it's the same word. The poha is the flattened rice. I powder the flattened rice, mix it in the banana, and make my child lick it. Now try it, Jalal. You will find it very tasty. Now a child would enjoy eating that. Now what does it have? It has got banana is 80% water. It's got sodium, potassium. It's got carbohydrate. So it is exactly what I give in oral rehydration, but in tastier form. This knowledge they've had for centuries. And here I am as a physician talking to them what the West told me is the right one. And I call them ignorant and you don't know what you're doing. If I had told her that you have to use only oral rehydration, don't use what you're using, then I am actually imitating the West. But here I am in this community where at least I had some amount of decency and self-realization and humility to say, wow, these guys had discovered it much before WHO did. So I actually wrote a letter to UNICEF and WHO those days and said, why are you guys talking of home available fluid? Give this culturally appropriate solution. And they laughed at
me. Sorry, incredible. So the story is very inspirational, and it has the full arc, which is that you found inspiration through finding the God within, both from the ordinary people to the extraordinary in Western and local context. But you also had an outrage, and the outrage was, why isn't the government sensitive or responsive to the needs of the people? So you kind of had both. Was there a moment in your life where you were really angry and upset, and that is what kind of gave you the fuel and gave you the rage that has been burning till now and gotten you to do all of those things in your life?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask this question. So, I keep telling, I keep people who know me very closely and have followed my career closely, if you can call it career, I don't even call it career, just my life. When I went into the forest in the early, in the mid to late 80s, the first time I started living amongst indigenous communities, um, the forest was declared a national park. I actually believed they were national parks. Much later in life, I realized, see, the act, all our acts, whether it's Pakistan or India, we've inherited act making, parliament procedures, all from the British. And we have not evolved. India is now moving on. We have discarded 2000 acts. We simply said they're irrelevant to our country. So each country moves on at its own pace, and I'm sure they'll all be happening at different levels. So every country. But those days the laws were there. And the law said that the state has to declare a national park. First, it has to declare its intent and then call for objections from citizens. The act was beautiful. It said the citizens can object. But nobody told the citizens that. And so these guys just declared their intent and called it national park, and they forgot the rest of the story. You're supposed to call for objections. You would either say that your objections are valid, I'll compensate you financially or otherwise for your objections. Those rights which are extinguishable, the state will extinguish them. Those rights which are compensatable, it will compensate. Nobody told these people, nobody even did this procedure. So I was so angry when I heard this. I sued the state. I sued the local government. I sued the national government. I took them to the Human Rights Commission. India has got a very strong National Human Rights Commission. I said this is violation of tribal rights. I said the right to live, the right to a decent livelihood is taken away by the state in the name of development. You build 4 reservoirs, you call a national park, and you take away the rights of people, and you don't compensate them for it. And I lost the case because the act was framed in such a way that you have to apply for the compensation within 7 years of that. And this was 30 years later of the act. In 1972, we passed this act, and I was a 7-year-old kid. I didn't even know that, but I was fighting for it in 1987, in 90s. So I was so angry. I was so frustrated. I said, "Come on, you!" And you said we have to publish in major national newspapers. I said, I was not getting newspaper those days in the forest, and there was no internet, right? And so my newspaper of today would come 3 days later by that one bus which would come there. Today things have changed. I'm talking of 40 years ago. So I said, even for me to get to know anything would take me 4 days, if only if I know English or Kannada. These tribals speak their own language, and you say, because they're not knowledgeable in your language, we follow the same Western model. Urbanites think that their solutions are perfect, and therefore, if you don't accept my solutions, you change your context. You're wrong and ignorant. They'll never say, I will become like you and learn to work with you. Learning to live with people and learning from them is what I learned. If I can look back and say that. So I felt so angry. I thought I would have taken the gun, but for my faith in Gandhi. I would have said, shoot these guys. But then I felt, no, this is a nation which gave us non-violence. This is a nation which taught us the power of satyagraha. Satya is truth. Agraha is to protest. So I have truth on my side. I'm going to protest. I became very popular for my protest. I would sit in protest demanding change. And that's a long story, but I went to courts. I won the cases. And that also gave me hope. The democratic institutions actually work because these people populating these institutions, if they are good, it works. And in India, they're very strong democratic institutions. So I showed that it works. And after that, I had faith and said, okay, now I know a way to fight. But that angry young man in me was very strong, and that's what maybe the anger comes from. But then later on, that's when the confrontational spirit came from. But then I realized anger can get your name in the newspapers, anger can get you a movie made about you and all that, but you can't institutionalize social transformation and change. Real transformation has to be an exercise where the power within manifests outside in a sustainable way. And that realization said, I have to collaborate. I have to understand why the state is not understanding citizens. I have to understand citizens and say, why are you not able to express confidently to the state? So I need to understand everybody else. And that started me on a journey of trying to discover my own self as well as understanding. So to me, leadership is about understanding the self, is understanding others around me, and understanding the actions that bind the self to the others around me. And it's always in context. In the context of studying, it's different. In the context of my job today, it's different. In the context of living with tribals, it was different. So I think that's where that journey of power within began for me. But when it got solidified as in my book, and why I called it power within, was what I discovered was very something. It started off again negatively. Archie Brown writes a powerful book after analyzing 5 great world leaders. He writes called The Myth of a Strong Leader. And I thought, wow, Gandhi was a strong leader, and you call him a myth, and each country has got their own strong leaders. Why do you call it a myth? So then I went deep into it. I studied his book. I started my own research, and I realized the definition of power as seen in the West is the power without. If I have followers, I'm a leader. If I don't have followers, I'm irrelevant. So identity of your existence comes from the validation that people behind you give you. Actually, that's not leadership. In India, Indic thinking says it is not the leader who is to be celebrated. It's the actions that he performs that need to be celebrated. And I was, wow, there's so much of a difference. They can't even understand it. Then I said, what is Archibald doing wrong? Because his metric was measuring power over people. And that if that is and that way he says you can't have permanently having power in a sustained way over people all the time in all contexts. Therefore, he says it's a myth. Then I realized it is not power over people. It is the power within you. And Chanakya or Kautilya, we use both the names for him, in his Arthashastra, which I think is a great treatise on governance that Indian civilization gave to the world, he writes it so beautifully. He says the king has only got two responsibilities. In a very simplified way, he says it. The first responsibility, he says, is lokasangraha, societal welfare. You have to care for the society, otherwise you don't deserve to rule. Second thing he says is yoga kshema, which means acquiring those things which will bring you security and protecting the securities which are already there for people. Whether it could be social security, emotional security, intellectual security, religious security, any kind of securities. And he says the only person who could do this is the person who is unattached to his position and is able to practice what he calls indriya nigraha, which means control over your senses. Senses includes the hunger for name, fame, what Heifetz calls in his language managing hungers. 2000 years ago, Chanakya writes and says Indriya Nigraha, and how do you control your senses? Only that man can deliver on this. So I thought that is the power within. And that's the instrumentality through which I started analyzing Prime Minister Modi. And I thought, here's a powerful example in flesh and blood, where I'm privileged of working under and can watch him from close quarters and could request him for interviews where I can say, I want to understand a little deeper, challenge him with questions that I had. And that's how I wrote the book.
And before we go into Prime Minister Modi's, you're capturing him in the book. I'd like to go into the history because I do think Prime Minister Modi has appeared at a certain inflection point in Indian history. He's definitely riding a wave. Both ways he has appeared at this time, and the nation is creating him, and he's creating the nation. But also, as a nation, India, since 1990s, has a different view of itself from the Hindu growth rate. From socialism, it has become much more confident, and so what I want to find from you is that in your own self confidence and the confidence of the nation, that you have discovered that, like the Chinese have Confucius, the West has Aristotle and Plato as their models for governance, that you have looked inwards into Arjuna and Krishna and Chanakya and Ashoka and found out models that are within your history and within the nation, and that are very relevant today. So is that a way of India coming to stage, or in this complete form, that you representing in this book, also in your thinking?
I think that's absolutely true. And let me explain this a little bit. History is just a storyline which a narrator creates. And unfortunately, our histories were corrupted with colonization. The British historians, some of them were very sincere and honest, if I can give them credit for it, could only see the lens through a particular cultural background. And if you're seeing us as natives, if you're seeing us as ignorant people who don't deserve to even rule their own countries, that's what Winston Churchill called us, right? When we were talking of independence, he said these rascals can't manage their own countries. And if you have such strong views, and that the West celebrates him as a leader, whereas we would look at him as, who is he to judge us? What does he know about us? Because he doesn't know about us, you operate with what you know. You don't even have a desire to know us. Whereas our civilizational thinking was of celebrating lifelong learning, was celebrating the control of the external nature as much as the control of the internal nature. We had metallurgy even much before the West discovered metallurgy. And we could also say we could go a deep dive inside us and control ourselves. How do you look at it? So from deep positive psychology, which Bhagavad Gita is all about, or the storylines that we had. In fact, to just give you an example of three or four different spaces in history in India, the civilizational history, how one common thread that runs through it. And so the paradigm is what we need to take. We shouldn't spend time on whether Mahabharata actually happened or Ramayana happened, Rama lived, or is he God, is he man. No, we waste our time on these distractions, we forget the message. And so I would say, if you look at it in the Ramayana, in the Mahabharata, there's a situation of two cousins fighting for power. And they fight each other, Kauravas and Pandavas. And Bhishma, who's considered to be the grandfather of both these warring cousins, is on his deathbed. And he's lying on a bed of arrows. And Yudhishthira, the king of the Pandavas, the head of the Pandavas, goes to Bhishma and says, now the war is nearly over. It's all done. We have won the war and you're dying. But before you die, is there any last minute advice you can give me? I'm going to rule the kingdom now. Now it's all done. All the hatred is gone. All the punishment has happened. It's very sad, but can you tell me how do I rule this country from here on? And he gives him 10 tenets, and I write in my book. It's perfect for any public leader today. West has lost its way. We seem to be thriving on enmity, and we see thriving on separating the other and not seeing yourself in the other. That's how we all look at it. And our countries have grown up on that kind of hatred, if you ask me. In this particular situation, he says, this is how we run a country. And that's so powerful. And that's the Rajadharma that we call. That means, how do you righteously rule your country? That's all it means. And it is religion agnostic, it is concept agnostic, it is geography agnostic. It's such a powerful, and in my book I write about it. But you look at a completely different storyline, okay, where we celebrate the person, the personality of Rama. In Mahabharata, there's hundreds of heroes for us, and Krishna is God. And that's where he talks to Arjuna and talks about he having to do his dharma or he has to play his role. Now today, the Western leadership that both of us learned from Heifetz is you will have to learn to differentiate role from self. And Krishna tells this to Arjuna. He says, Arjuna, the cousin is one role. Arjuna, the grandson is one role. Arjuna, the uncle is one role. Don't get caught in that role. But Arjuna, the warrior defending peace. Arjuna, the Kshatriya fighting for righteousness is completely another role. And you're coming that role here today. So you can't throw down your bow and say, I'm weak and I can't kill my own uncles and cousins. It's your damn job to do it. You will be a failure only when you don't do your dharma. And dharma here is play your role. And in the same context, in a different storyline in Ramayana, where we celebrate Rama as the ultimate human being, perfect in ethics and perfect in every sense of the word, he goes away to the forest because his stepmother conspires against him and gets him banished by his father or her husband to the forest. The younger brother comes running to him and says, you are the oldest brother. You were coronated to be the next king. You're already appointed. You were trained, built to be the king. I am the lowest, the chota boy of the family. I had my fun. And suddenly I have to rule the kingdom. How unfair is this? I'm not ready for it. I'm not prepared. It's unjust. And then he says, I'm going to take your footwear, keep it as a representation of you and rule the kingdom in your name. But to do that, I don't know how to rule. Is there something you can tell me? And Rama describes to him how he should run his country. How should you take counsel, the mantra shakti that you need to have. The mantri should give you the inputs. How democracy should be flourishing. How traders should be respected. How intellectuals should grow. How schools should be run. Every small thing. How currency should be understood. The economy. It's a lesson in economics to societal growth to social intervention. And he tells him, you do all this, we'll be doing a good job. And Arthashastra is completely practical. It's more about 600, 700 years ago, advising the kings, he writes his treatise. Artha is economy. So essentially, it's about economy and using economic power for public welfare. So he talks of how, in a deep sense, if you break down Kautilya's Arthashastra, it's not about making money and the country economically powerful. It's about how do you invest on human and social capital and reap the economic consequences of it. The Western model is how do you build the economic model stronger and then hope the social development will happen, right? And here we have, and that would have been so relevant to our countries. Just imagine 75 years ago, if both our countries had taken the narrative of investing on its human and social capital, we would have been leading economic powers today. But we copied the Western model and then simply said, okay, we simply invest and some beg and get money from somewhere. And it's never worked for both the countries. India then discovered, no, let's try out this model. It had the courage, especially after this prime minister came 10 years ago, say, why don't we take our identity as our strength? Why don't we take a cultural rootedness as our strength? Indians thrive Most of the major CEOs around the world, from Google to Microsoft, are Indians today, right? And Indra Nooyi, an Indian woman, was Pepsi CEO. So any
Is there a reason that has happened in this way, or it was just a factor of how the
I
society
think
education is working?
I think the last 10 years it's a very clear outward expression. Where other India was seen as a poor country, unknown. I myself can recognize 30 years ago when I went to our talks or presentations, I even had questions like, "Where is India?" I would actually put a map and show them this is India, and it was so stupid. Today, you don't have to say that because you're given a new resurgence of an identity called Indian. We also talk of the Bharatiya, and where we talk about our cultural strength. We are not ashamed of it anymore. We grew up on shame. Today we are taking pride. Our languages, we have 30,000 languages, and I'm sure in the context of in Pakistan also, you'll have so many dialects and so many languages. We just think it's only Urdu and English. It's not true, right? You might have so many different anthropologically strong groups with their own dialect. India's got 30,000 dialects. 10,000 are even today spoken and used. It's not as though they're not used. The West can't even figure it out. So we end up, the reason why you and I learned such good English was our forefathers taught the best way to join the West is imitate them. I'm not complaining. I'm glad I learned English. But English should be an instrument of business, a tool for Vyavaharik Jivan. But our cultural strength comes from our what we can relate to, the language in which we think. And I feel that is what that. So language is an identity, dress is an identity, our culinary strength is an identity. Today, Indian food across the world, we have Indian restaurants, right? And whether London to United States 30 years ago, we had no choice. Today, there is plenty of choice. No, and I think so. The diplomacy is of all kinds. And we also took strength in the fact that culturally we have said Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is a family. Everybody is a family member. So it only talks culturally of peace and looking at everybody as a family member. So when COVID broke out, close to 70 countries got their vaccines free of cost from India. We said COVID is not just India's problem, right? At great cost, 40% of our vaccine getting produced was sent outside the country also because we said everybody needs it. Today, if there's a earthquake in Turkey, the first hospital put up was Indian Army, which went there, set up a makeshift hospital, did the maximum number of surgeries immediately. Very next day, they were there. So, humanitarian diplomacy to cultural diplomacy to culinary diplomacy to uh, when our prime minister travels abroad, all our nations suffer from that. All these guys took away all our artifacts, right? And he makes it a point to previously have it negotiated, comes back with one or two artifacts back from all these museums that they show proudly, and gets it reinstalled in India. So even small things like that gets us pride, whether language, dress, food, strength of talking outside, and you get a power when you know that you have nothing to gain from this. The West understands hard power. We have the hard power too. The West doesn't understand smart power. It's now understanding soft power. But I think India has taken it to the next level and saying you got to be systems thinker, you got to think of all dimensions, and you got to build the nation in that thinking. So I think the Renaissance is really a decade old now. Maybe the preparation was beginning earlier itself. Everybody was feeling, why am I like this? And the restlessness must have started earlier. But capitalizing on the restlessness, giving it a narrative, shaping it into an identity, giving us courage and the strength to think that we can think like this. Even small things like moving up the economic ladder. Today, we're talking about $5 trillion economy. We're already nearly the fourth largest economy in the world. And our plans, look at it, no country in the world. And what I really appreciate the way we think today is 62% or 70% of the world has gone for elections this year. Not a single leader who's standing for elections speaks beyond short term thinking of the next electoral battle. I have to win the election, so I'll give everything free. But the only person who's world leader who's balanced short-term thinking with long-term thinking. In policy, we say balancing short-termism with long-termism is a great art of policy making, right? We talk of 25 years from today, 100 years of India in 2047, because it's Bharat, how should it look? We have a strategy plan which is rolled out this year. And at the same time, you got to win the elections. Otherwise, you won't be the prime minister to roll it out, right? And that's the reality of our political economies. You have to promise a lot of things. The promises have to be made. You have to deliver on that also. At the same time, you can't lose sight of the larger strategic vision. And that strength comes from, I think, a combination of all these factors. So the social change, the economic change, the political change, and the cultural civilizational shift from looking down on ourselves to taking pride in ourselves. And the fact that around the world, diaspora has become a very powerful community. Today, I was reading an article on Kamala Harris, and I was reading an article how a population of Indians, which hardly form less than 1% of the total population of the United States, have a very strong political voice because of their money power in shaping the political narrative of the United States too. So, which that's a different expression of power. I'm only saying that it exists. Whether you want to encash it or not is a different call. So, all these factors combined together has given us the strength, is my feeling.
And then the wife of J.D. Vance is also of Indian origin, so that definitely
Exactly.
that's the case. So I would imagine that what you want is through your book and through Prime Minister Modi's leadership style, you want the Indian historical leadership model to go to the world. So I would imagine that that's the case. So one of the things you greatly talk about is, of course, purpose, which is, of course, a big part of the dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna in terms of dharma. Because, of course, Arjuna faces his cousins on the other side as weak knees and wants to quit, and rightly so. And some people would think that's an honorable thing to do, to not to fight in such a war. But yet he is kind of counseled to think about his purpose and something else which is called, I think, more motiveless action. You know,
What we call
and so
karma yoga.
yeah, karma yoga. And so tell us a little bit about those concepts, and that how does it reflect in Prime Minister Modi's action, his rise to power, which is phenomenal from an ordinary person. That doesn't happen in our part of the world. So how does that Arjuna, that aspect of the lesson of Bhagavad Gita, lives through Prime Minister Modi?
See, I think it's a great way to begin. All leadership action begins with a deep sense of purpose. Now, discovering, like Mark Twain, if you but use a Western language, in his writings, he writes, every person is born twice, he writes. And in a very nice way. And he says, first time when you actually are born, the biological birth. And he says, the second time when you discover why you are born. And it's a very powerful expression. And if you look at this, the why do we exist? A simple question that the great Indian monk called Ramana Maharishi said. The only philosophy he said human beings should ask for is a simple question: who am I? This is the existential question: who am I? Am I this body which is called Balu by others? Am I this body which is called Jalal? Who am I? Can you go deeper into yourself? Who is the person asking this question even? So as you go deeper and deeper, you will suddenly understand that there is no separation. The interconnectedness, the duality is only a way we see each other, and that's what in Indian thinking is illusory. We say the real purpose of life is to discover oneness with mankind itself, that all of us are one consciousness. Now that's a journey. Many of us can't do it, and since we don't do it, maybe we're given us the liberty of multiple births and say, okay, in your next birth you can continue the journey. But my way of looking at it is the serious part of this question is, can I use this opportunity to live in this world? And that's what Vivekananda said. Treat the world as a gymnasium where you're born to keep strengthening yourselves. Constant, every action that we do, can we really look at it from a strong perspective? And he says it so beautifully. He's gone to the US, and the man who sponsored his visit to the US was the Maharaja of Mysore, my town where I live today, the city of Mysore. And the Maharaja gives him the money, and he writes a letter from there to the Maharaja and says, and he's a king, and those his kings were kings. And tells him the vanities of life are transient. He writes, my dear prince, please know that the vanities of life are transient. He alone lives who lives for others. The rest are more dead than alive. So the real purpose of life itself is to understand that you have to live for others. No, we have become, again, this is the narrative, the Western narrative is so individualistic, I live only for myself. So the greatest lesson you understand from Mahabharata to me is, the first point is, anybody can become weak with the internal dilemmas. When the moral dilemma takes over, when you're unsure of what am I doing, is the external action is killing somebody. The strength comes from inside to kill, and the strength is not coming because the dilemma has started. So all of us have these conflicts. Is what am I doing right? Is what am I doing wrong? And who's right and who's wrong? How do we judge right and wrong? Who's got the right absolute answer? None of us have. How do you think about these questions? So it's a metaphor for the struggle we all have in our lives. And the best way to solve this is, ask yourself, what is your purpose of existence? What is the purpose, the role that you're playing today? The purpose of your existence is to protect dharma, to fight evil. And that's what Krishna sort of narrates to Arjuna. And so we have to discover what purpose each of us have. And for Modi, what I discovered is that as a young child, it's a very, very small incident which is not in the public domain, only first time in my book has brought it out. In his little village in Gujarat, he discovers that his neighbor's family, they're a barren couple, no child for a long time, and suddenly they have a baby. The whole village celebrates. This is how India was, and India or Pakistan, all of us together, that kind of communitized life. The happiness was the whole village. He says, wow, this family has a baby. Everybody's house is making a sweet. What kind of community it was, right? It's so powerful. But what happens a week later, that baby dies. The whole village descends into gloom and they're grieving. And he notices the cow of that family, the neighbor's family, stops eating food. And little Modi is very confused. He says, what is this? This cow is not eating. What's happened to it? He goes to his father and says, this cow has stopped eating food. What's happening? And the father, in his own way, because every father has got a way to answer a year old child. And he says, in his own way, he says, oh, child, you won't understand. Maybe the cow is grieving because it was there in the family for a long time. It was very happy the baby was born. Maybe the cow is showing its grief for the family by not eating. A week later, the cow dies. And Modi is really shattered. He goes and then he starts thinking and says, if an animal, and at that age you believe what is told to you, right? And he says, if an animal can feel so strongly for mankind, for a human being, and dies out of grief, how much strongly should I, a human being, feel for another human being who's suffering? How strongly should I not relate to him? And that is his inflection point. That is what Warren Bennis in the Western narrative calls it the crucible moment. No, all of us have such experience. Each one of us. Ragging was my experience. You will have your own experience for doing what you're doing. You could have had a great life in the West. Why are you in Karachi trying to say, I'm going to do something for my country? Each of us have our own narratives, our own public, right? The inflection point, many of us actually treat them as not as experiences or as a data point, but we reflect on it. The Mahabharata is an opportunity for us to get into the inner self and reflect. Every conflict we have, can we reflect on it? Can we go to the balcony and watch ourselves and say, what is it that I'm doing? Who am I in this drama? How am I playing it? Am I really doing justice to it? So I see the West has also explained it very well, like Heifetz's work and all that, but it has not got this cultural rootedness which we all grew up with. It's very easy for us to relate to this and ask for a higher purpose in life, because my purpose of existence itself was to discover the higher purpose. For Modi, it was seva. He calls it seva bhav. And says everybody should be serving all the time. He says, I'm the Pradhan Sevak, I'm not the Prime Minister. That's what he calls himself. And so from that perspective, when I saw what is it common, I did 50 years of his life's research. From a 17-year-old to maybe last year, I have possibly a lot of material on him. 17 to 19, he traveled around the country, and that's his very private time. He spent time in reflection, in meditation, in monasteries, in ashrams, just trying to discover and reflecting on this hunger, right? What should I do? Maybe that's his second birth. But after that, he joins the RSS movement, which is by design, it's a cultural nationalism kind of an organization, which does a lot of service. Any crisis, disaster, they are the ones who go out to serve. And as a pracharak, as a full-time pracharak, devotes his life to service, travels around the country. Now, he's possibly the only prime minister in this country who traveled extensively around the country for 30, 40 years, even before becoming prime minister. Now, after becoming prime minister, everybody will travel because that's a necessity of the job. So the connectedness, he can pick up his phone and talk to anybody in any state because he's already connected to him in some way. And that gives you an appreciation of the voice of the poor, the voice of the marginalized, because the RSS pracharak's life is very unique. They have no money with them. Some family has to feed them. They give the money to go to the next place. And so they're always taken care of by society. So they have to depend on the community support. And that's where his understanding of communities comes from. So I realized the sense of purpose is the foundation. For him, it was service. Each of us have a sense of purpose. For me, it was seeing God in the other. And I use service as an instrument. Mahatma Gandhi says, discovering oneself in the service to others should be our motto. And that's a different way of saying this. Most of the global leaders say the same thing in different ways. But what it means to us, making an experience a crucible moment and trying to reflect on it, discover a sense of purpose is the first step of the journey. But it's not enough. Vivekananda says it so beautifully. He said you need 3 H, he says. First H, he says, is the heart to feel. As a young boy, you see the neighbor's cow dying, that's the heart to feel. Then he says you need the head to think. Today in leadership, we say motivation, strategy, action. Motivation is hard to feel. Strategy is the head to think. What can I do about this? Action is the hands to work. I got to get down and do something about it. So leadership action is more critical. You can't be a general talking about how to win the war. You got to be the soldier out there. You got to be the general, and you got to be the passionate believer too. So I think leadership from a very civilizational perspective gives us this strength to see it this way. Today, neurobiologically, being a physician, I could go a little deep into neurobiological research. I write about it in this book too. Is the thinking part of the brain and the cognitive part of the brain, but the real strength comes from the prefrontal cortex today, which is the executive part of the brain. And the fibers that come from the emotive part and the cognitive part come together. And the densest fibers today, because the fMRI scans, we can actually spot this, is in the prefrontal part. When I was a young medical student, we didn't even know what the prefrontal cortex does. We thought it's an appendage organ. We don't know what it does. We don't need it. Evolution just is gone beyond using the prefrontal cortex. Today, we know the executive part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And all of the procedures in India, whether Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, whether it is meditation, pranayama, all of them show clearly the more you practice it. Dalai Lama has done studies in the University of Chicago and the Brain Research Institutes, etc., where the more you meditate, the more you activate the prefrontal cortex, the more you develop the power of executive leadership. So it's very strange. Monks don't want it, but give a problem to them, they would possibly solve it better than most leaders trained in the space. So to me, discovering purpose, keeping purpose beyond outside of yourself, staying focused on delivering on your purpose. He has stayed on focus for 50 years, not making it about yourself. It's not about me, but seeing myself as the instrumentality of change. Vivekananda says it so powerfully again. He says, don't stand on a pedestal and say, here, my poor man, take my 5 cents. Don't think you're great that you're giving some money to the poor, but consider yourself privileged that you've been provided with an opportunity to serve the other. So he says, God is like the cow. Cow which gave birth to the calf knows how to feed it milk. God knows how to take care of his people. So you are just being used as an instrument by this higher power. And if you can discover that power within and recognize the divinity outside, I think that's all the world needs today. And that's what I've tried to establish in this book. So what I brought out is not Prime Minister Modi's leadership. What I brought out is this Indic thinking of leadership, validated it with the Western lens because they can accept it more easily. I'm using him as a case, as a life and blood case study today to show that it is possible. Somebody has done it, so why can't you and I do it? Somebody was selling tea on a railway station platform. Today is the executive head of the country. And the political barriers are enormous. Unless you have a powerful father, and in our country's dynasty politics is what works. You don't get to be the prime minister. But his journey is ordinary tea seller becoming the prime minister of the country, a highly articulate, educated communicator who understands the realities of the world today, can connect to citizens as well as to global leaders. It's once in a lifetime kind of opportunity, and therefore I used him as an exemplar to see whether he's got these qualities, and I discovered them and I write about it.
You know, you talked about action, karma yoga. I think that's what is in Bhagavad Gita, and that the real change is in action, and you must think and have motivation, and then must act. So, and I do believe that Prime Minister Modi's prime ministership, even CM-ship, is about action, is about moving forward. One thing that I was very impressed, but it was a very risky move at that time, and for a long time, it was seen as something which was probably not the right thing to do, was demonetization. Now, in terms of action, I think it was a very risky action to do. But I think with hindsight, it was a fantastic thing. In fact, I advocate for demonetization for Pakistan for separate reasons. So tell us about certain inflection points where he took action which was seemed unpopular at that times. Where did he find the strength? Where did he find the collective wisdom and the support to do that?
See, I think I actually use, and it'll be very interesting for people in Pakistan to read it, is the entire Kashmir story. And because people only look at the Article 370 as an important thing, but the adaptiveness of the whole story, the narrative that was created and sold to all of us as young people across the borders, it doesn't matter which side of the fence you live on. And then each of us have a narrative, a public narrative, which we have to, I believe in my public narrative, you'll believe in your public narrative, but getting both of us and our perspectives together across the table and shaping one common narrative of development and no hatred, and can we bring peace finally to the valley and all. I'm just giving you in a larger sense one context, but I want to say two examples. The demonetization is a powerful example. Hindsight, economists might argue both ways. There are economic thinkers who say it's a great move. It eliminated large currency from the market, but currency came back. Money comes back. India is an informal economy. What people don't realize is, along with demonetization, something else happened. The economic model of India was 94% was informal economy. The gray
Uniform,
market is
yes.
so strong. The black market, all
Yes.
of us know, we all grow on black money, right? And it's a challenge because you store money and you only deal in cash. You evade taxes. You don't. It cannot be tracked. Expenditures cannot be tracked. And
Same.
today's world,
Same here.
it's a problem, right. All our country,
Yeah.
at least some Asian countries, suffer from that. So what happened parallelly was deployment of technology, where
Digitization.
we have the world's best digital public infrastructure today, India Stack, what we call it. Getting in smartphones, virtually every Indian today has got a smartphone. 14% of Apple phones sold this year was made in India. Right, and so we have a huge price advantage. We have a very strong digital infrastructure. Most of government governance happens. All my files I see on computers and from a long time, not just today. Everything we track. In fact, very strangely, the job I do, the mission is called Mission Karmayogi. So the Prime Minister's call is you have to make the civil servants transition from feeling that I'm a karmachari, a public servant, just doing my job for a salary. He says that's okay, but that's not enough. Transitioning from a karmachari to a karmayogi is what the mission Karmayogi does, and that's my job today. So, just coming back to your question, when he actually demonetized, you also understand that it stimulated and kick-started more urgent absorption of the digital public infrastructure we created. Today, you walk into any Indian village, and I can challenge you for this, any Indian village across the country, huge country,
Yes.
walk into any petty shop. That guy may speak any language, but he will say Google Pay kar diye, Google Pay use kijiye sir. And he'll use Paytm or Amazon Pay or Google Pay as though he's born with it. No, that guy would not know anything else on the phone how to use it, but he'll know how to scan and pay you. From a tender coconut to a small little cigarette you buy in a store, that means every single transaction is getting recorded today. Every single transaction is going through your bank. More and more today, look at the healthy economy we have is because when we brought in a very unpopular thing called the goods and service tax. Very few nations have succeeded in bringing GST. Right, even Canada is
And
still struggling.
nationwide, something nationwide, I think. That's right.
It's one single tax nationwide.
Yeah.
It's a unified taxation system in a highly federal country like India, where one state will not agree with the next state. Each one had his own slabs of tax. Today, in fact, we have written a case study on it, how we did it. And it's a very democratic process. It's not the government of India which decides it anymore. There's a council, the great leadership where chief ministers of every state represent or their finance ministers represent. They decide the rate of taxation. They decide the product will be taxed at what rate, and there's a constitutional body called the Finance Commission which reallocates the money back to the states. And today it's a very strong mechanism, and you will not believe it. In our language, we talk in lakhs. I think Pakistan also uses lakhs only. So every month we collect 2 lakh crore rupees as indirect taxes. You cannot even believe this. Know what? 80% of direct taxes, only 3-4% of Indians pay direct taxes. Rest was 20% was indirect taxes. Today it's nearly 50-50. The tax bracket has increased, compliance has increased. So what was very unpopular, GST was criticized, and for 25 years every government was promising, but nobody had the courage to do it. But the
Yes.
Prime Minister said, I will do it. And he did it. And that's a greatness. Demonetization, the trauma and the pain could also be absorbed. It also pushed us towards using the digital money today. Today, wallets and digital monies, we have the world's highest transactions. All entire world put together doesn't cross 50% of what India's digital transactions are. So you can understand what level we have gone, right? Everybody in India uses it. Everybody has a cell phone to use it. But I can tell you another thing also. As much as he's a risk taker and is fearless, because we are driven by the conviction that it is national good. I asked him this question: what gives you the energy to do these things? He said, I have a
Yes.
very simple filter. He says, I ask, will this do good to my country? And I believe in it, I'll do it. But he believed in the farm laws. He said it can create agrarian reform. It will double farmers' income. And there's a very great agriculture scientist in India called Swaminathan who gave a committee report 35 years ago. He borrowed a lot of it from that and said, every government promises to implement this report, nobody has the courage. I'm going to do it. I'll break the trader mafia. I'll give the farmers entry into the global markets. Brings in the farm laws, passes it in parliament, Farmers go on a strike, very, very elite farmers from only parts of Punjab and other places. All of them had reasons. They might have, in their views, legitimate reasons, but southern farmers were not bothered because they knew that they'll benefit. But after a year, he had to withdraw the law. And if you look at his speech, he said, I'm sorry, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe India is not ready for it. Maybe I didn't explain it to you all properly. So it's still my error. So I'm sorry, I'm withdrawing it. For a leader with 78% popularity rate, to come out there and say, guys, I made a mistake, it's not easy. I have seen him at both the time. When the law came in, when the law was withdrawn, he was equipoised. So as much as he's got his fearlessness, as much as he's got his detachment from consequences of his action, like the Karma Yoga says, he's also, there's a concept in Bhagavad Gita called samatvam. Ekatvam is the oneness of interconnectedness. Samatvam is balanced. So he's extremely unaffected by the decisions. He knows he has to do it. He did it, but it didn't work. Fine, so be it. And he didn't lose sleep. And he continued on, and we continued to work on what needs to be done. He went back to the drawing board and said, well, if this is not working, let's find out how we can double farmers' income in some other ways. So I think the lesson from the Gita that he lives is, apart from a sense of purpose, the clarity of differentiating role from self, the absolute dispassion for what he does, the ability to discriminate what he thinks is right from wrong, national good versus private good, and then looking at, also the conviction that you got to be lifelong learner. You don't know everything. He's a deep listener. He will listen to you when you explain, and he'll never forget. He lives in the moment of time. Bhagavad Gita says, neither carry the guilt of the past nor the fear of the future. And he lives in the present. And that's a beauty. I think all the messages that he lives.
So I remember the demonetization, because initial days it looked chaotic and it looked like it had backfired. But now, and digitization, because we haven't gone through digitization, and I run a business, and the cash is a big problem, and it leads to leakages, and it stops me from investing. So I do understand that how digitization has really propelled India. I think GST is another example. Tax has a way of collating, making a cohesive society is also very important. We are all submitting to a unified tax at some level. So we are submitting to some unified rules of behavior. Also, bringing a nation together is very important. But I'd like to, and you brought it up, the Article 370, because this was changing a Nehruvian law, which was very much built into India's secular democracy, and the way India operated and projected itself, that look, Kashmir is a state which has special mandate and everything. How did that come about? And of course, that meant that there was going to be repercussions. So do you have some history on the decision and the follow-up to that?
I would strongly recommend read the chapter I wrote on that. I explain this entire chapter I devoted to that. And the beauty in which adaptive leadership emerges, how stakeholder consultations happen, how the work at the center was focused, what was a mandate that was given. It is not about repealing Article 370. It is an instrument. It is about bringing progress, development, integration to the rest of the country. Because you can't have within a nation a part of the nation which says, I will have a person who heads the government in that nation who is also called the Prime Minister. Later on, they start calling him the Chief Minister. We have two Prime Ministers, two constitutions, two separate geographical entities, two separate national central banks. It can't work. You can't have one national identity, what we spoke about, the unifying factors of GST, etc. And you also develop challenges because you start identifying yourself not as part of one country, and then that's where the problem starts. So when it was resolved at a particular point of history that we are going to secede to the union and we are going to be part of the country, or we're going to accede to the union, and then you can't, you culturally grow up in that, and for various reasons, our nations live with distorted history. The way I see it, I blame you, you blame me, and we'll always see the blame, but we'll never see how do we work together. I believe that we are missing out opportunities. The togetherness can bring in greater opportunities, and so these problems have to be solved. They're adaptive challenges. It can't be solved. It calls for deep changes of beliefs, deep changes of behaviors based on all this that we see. And these communities were believing for a long time that religious identity is at stake. They're going to get separated out. Somebody will come and take over their state. All this kind of opinions. They have to be reassured. You have to reassure the rest of the world that we are not anti-Muslim. There's no such sentiment. It is just that we want integration, and they have a right to live their lives as they are. At the same time, a part of that state, the Ladakh region, the Buddhist region, has the right to live their way they are. So that had to be made a union territory. This had to be left behind as a state. The identities of Kashmirian that to be protected. And that's a very strong identity. And traditionally, if you look at Kashmir, it is such a cultural strength. No, a lot of great Hindu Indian saints came from Kashmir. That's a very strange
Yes,
part.
the Kashmiri
Great deal of,
Pandits.
right? Yeah. Shankaracharya went to Kashmir. The Kashmiri Valley is full of great temples. So it's a history of love and affection between each other. The communities live together. So how do you get back to that space? His journey started 35 years ago. He conducted what is called the Ekta Yatra to attempt to unify. And said, I will fly the tricolor in the middle of the valley. If anybody kills me, it's okay. I'll give my life up to this country. So people don't track his attempting to solve the Kashmir problem over 35 years of ripening the issue, talking to different stakeholders, understanding their perspectives. Finally, 100 families control the narrative in that state. And they were the ones who were the elites making the money, and all the national wealth was getting taken away by these forces. And they had to be controlled because the ordinary people were not benefiting. They were never part of the economic narrative. Today, you go visit it, at least there is peace. Everybody feels I'm making my living, from the fellow boathouse fellow, tourist fellow, to the guide, to the government person, to the police fellow. Yes, we have a problem of terrorism. I don't want to get into that because it will distract the narrative for our discussion. But the way I see it is, there are problems. Every country has got these problems. We have to solve them. But what is more utilitarian? What is more egalitarian? And what can bring in the larger good? If that narrative is focused on, I think we can solve a lot of problems. Today, poverty levels have come down. There is peace. Children are going back to schools, and tourism has started again. Economic growth is happening, and people want that. So why don't you respond to what people want? And instead of trying to again go back and say, no, no, that's not what you should want, because your life is in danger, and therefore you have to commit some crime or kill somebody, throw stones. We've not had a single stone pelting incident in the last 4 5 years. I can understand there might have been anger created because of false narratives. Once I recognize that the true narrative is peace, profits, people, and the planet, I think people will start growing out. And so, how was it done? Is the book. I don't want to make the trailer the movie and give out the.
I have to get hold of the book. As you know, my things is based mostly on your interviews and everything. So tell me one thing: is you mentioned about the law, the agrarian law, where
Law. Yeah.
Narendra Modi had to walk back. Is there anything that you think politically that he regrets over his last at least 30 years? That in your discussion or reflection, he thought he could have dealt differently?
From my research, strangely, I could never see regret. That's why I say equipoise. No, he might have had regret. He's not expressed it. At least I couldn't discover it in my research. But his equipoise is something I can say with certainty. He doesn't get distracted. He doesn't. There's something very fascinating about him. He can take incidents without show of emotion. So the emotions cloud. He never gets angry. I couldn't discover a single incident in 50 years of research where he's angry. I couldn't discover a single incident which publicly humiliated any bureaucrat. In private, he might.
Wow. Okay.
And in a meeting, you come and make a presentation to him. He will give you his 100%. He will listen deeply, ask questions. And to me, people credit him with elephantine memory. I don't credit him with elephantine memory. I credit him with giving 100% to what is happening in that moment of time. And therefore, he can remember. So if you are speaking to him, he will give you his complete attention. There is nothing else for him. And you come and meet him after 5 years, he'll say, जब आप मुझसे मिले थे 5 साल के पहले, आपने ये बोला था, क्या हुआ उसके बारे में क्या किया आपने? No, people like me have problems. We don't even remember what we told him 4 months ago. And security reasons, we can't carry anything on our hands when we go to a meeting with him. We write down with a pencil whatever is told to us, and then you have to remember what did you tell him or what did he tell us. But he won't forget. He meets hundreds of people a day. He sticks to his meeting schedule. If he says 6 o'clock, he meets you at 6 o'clock. And if he says 6:30, the meeting ends at 6:30. But you will never feel rushed. It's an extraordinary quality. And I describe it. I describe an Indic philosophy of communication called Sadharanikaran. And the meaning of Sadharanikaran is simplification. I also describe Western models of communication that leaders use. The Shannon-Weaver model, the participatory model, the dispersive model. And I say why they're not complete, why Sadharanikaran is so complete. And 3,000 years ago, Bharata Muni describes it in Natya Shastra. In India, even how to act is described. The Natya Shastra is all about dramatics. And there he says, how does a stage performer communicate emotion to the audience? Today, neurobiology says mirroring neurons. He describes it and says simplification, exact theory of communication Western world has got, but one element is missing. He says decoding and encoding. That's encoding happens first and the decoding happens at the receiving end. Even the West says it, but he says the encoder and the decoder are unified by what is called saharidayata, the oneness of the heart. And the oneness of the heart is what can create sahakaryata. So when Prime Minister Modi meets a global leader, he creates the saharidayata. That is why G20, at the time of the conflict of Ukraine and Russia, where last year in Bali, in Indonesia, they didn't have a statement because they said until you solve the Russia-Ukraine problem, you can't solve it. India solved it. We had a joint declaration. The G20 Delhi declaration was achieved because the Prime Minister deals the space of Saharidayata. And Sahakaryata can emerge only after that. I have seen him powerfully live this. He never gets ruffled, never gets angry. And I'm not trying to praise him because I have no reason to praise. I can objectively validate everything I've written. For me, the greatest joy of this was when you're writing about a personality you're working for and you're watching very closely, proximity can cloud you. No, you may not see a lot of things. You can, and he's a people admire 78% popularity rating means a lot of people admire him. You can also get drowned in that admiration and start believing what you see. So I told myself one thing: whatever the price I have to pay, I'm not going to pay the price of intellectual integrity being compromised. My book, 50 pages is my research notes and 30 pages is my glossary and all that. But the book is only 250 pages. The entire book is around 350, 400 pages because I had to substantiately prove to the academic world, as much as it is a practitioner's toolkit for public leaders, for corporate leaders. Bill Gates has endorsed the book. He's written a blurb for the book. Top businessmen of India, Anand Mahindra, Ajay Piramal, N. Chandra, the chairman of Tata Sons, they have endorsed it. As much as a tribal woman in the forest of Mysore has endorsed it. Bureaucrats have endorsed it. They've read the book and written blurbs for it. So most academicians have endorsed it. Academicians say there's Nitin Noria wrote the foreword to the book. That itself should validate what it is. The former dean of Harvard Business School, he's not just going to write something, right? He read it and said, "This is worthy of my foreword. I'm going to write it." So I
And a very
believe.
pleasant and a
Sorry,
very, very noble person. Himself a very pleasant, a very noble person, isn't Nori? I highly
extraordinary person,
respect him. Yes.
and
So,
such a respected person. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
but even Buddha faced dukkha, he faced suffering, and he faced regret. So, when you say that Prime Minister Modi has not faced regret, or at least you have not encountered it, like that cannot be like there must be things either that he's not shared or something that he would regret over his career. Because
See,
Buddha, everyone suffers. The suffering is everyone does it. It's
I
part of
think
life.
that's what gives inflection points to us, and that going deep into why did I feel disturbed, etc. I'm not even saying he must not have faced. I only can say I didn't discover it in my research. So it would be wrong for me to say he's. I can definitively say I found him equipoised in my research, but he might have developed the equipoise over several such disturbing realities that he might have faced. So he might have reached a point of conquering those emotions. I'm not even saying he might not have had. It is just that the kind of information access I had and the kind of storyline I could track. If I'd watched him, if I'd done an ethnographic research of the person and his actions over 25, 30 years of close observation, possibly I might have noticed. But here I only have to go through discussions, available material, public documents, private documents, and track patterns. And based on the patterns, ensure that they're validated. I can triangulate what I discover, only then I can write. So I have to be very conscious of that. So I might not have discovered is a better way of putting it, instead of saying that he might not have any regrets. That may not be the right way of putting it.
So now let's kind of zoom in, go into the past, into the leadership model of the tribal leader who talks about insects growing up and everything that is growing up and everything and being inclusive biodiversity. To now, which is India's big soft power was the secular democracy that it had, which was seen as more inclusive. Some people think that was like, cozying up to the Muslims, but generally under Congress, it was much more inclusive which is now seen as much more Hindutva driven under Prime Minister Modi. So, how do you balance at least the perception of Prime Minister Modi and the nationalism, Indian nationalism that he's projecting to that tribal chief who saw more inclusive way of leadership?
I think it's an important question, and that we need to face the elephant in the room. So I had the same challenge because I come from a space of uh, seeing my life's mission as seeing God in everybody. So I always try to say, how do I not fragment anybody? Like how I cannot see the Muslim in Jalal. I can just see the what God you call that God, I don't care. But if I can see God in that person, that's all matters to me. And I don't even expect you to see God in me. You don't have to even respect the God I see in myself or anybody, but I should be able to respect the God in you. That's how I have always trained myself to think. And when a lot of people ask me this question, because there are narratives, there are events, there are incidents, there are anecdotes. Each one has a historical way of representing it and talking about it. So actually, as an author, it gives me the privilege to ask him questions too. So in the book, I write about this. In fact, I even written about it, and that's the way I look at my integrity. I asked him a question: is why is this narrative? Obviously, there's a political perspective to the narrative. Every politician has got their own narratives. For example, right now the India's budget has come out. I consider it one of the finest budgets. And the political necessity is you give money to two states whose support you got for running your government. Every politician would have done it. Every government would have done it because you have to also run the government. But the narrative being created is your entire budget is only for two states. That is impossible. You can never run a country that way. You focus a lot on two states, but the entire country gets a benefit. And there are a lot of programs where 42% of the revenues constitutionally go back to the states. You can't. No national government can stop it. So the narrative you fashion, if you read only the narrative, it looks as though, oh my God, these guys are really screwing up. But if you actually have the courage to read the entire budget document, you'll realize just because I don't mention state A or state B or state C doesn't mean they're getting the money. I mention two states by name and give them little more money than others because I need the political strength that it gives me. And that's anybody would have done. That is my way of looking at it. As a policy analyst, I would look at it that way. Is anything compromised? Is money for other states being taken away and given to somebody else? Then you have to make an argument. But if you read the papers and see the television, you will start believing certain things. So for me also, I've grown up on this kind of television and news. Finally, end of the day, you don't have the data to process certain facts. So I asked him directly, how do you feel, sir? People make an accusation. People say this and people say that. People worship you as a great unifier. People also say that you're not respecting secularism. So he told me when I was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and that's when a lot of accusations started. Actually, if you look at it, there's only one major accusation which successive courts and those days he was not in power. It was completely Congress was in power. The Central Bureau of Investigations, their own CBI's investigation, their own High Court, Supreme Court, everything at that point of time. It can't be their own. They're all independent bodies. Completely ruled out his involvement in what happened in the riots and everything else. Now, somewhere you have to trust your own institutions. You can't just say because they don't agree with your narrative, they are wrong. So I asked him, how would you do it? He said, when I was Chief Minister of Gujarat, a reporter courageously asked me, what have you done for Muslims? And I thought this is a question I wanted to ask you too, but I didn't mention that. He said, I answered, I have not done anything. Then the reporter was shocked. I was shocked, when I'm studying. He said, your face is exactly the reporter's face. I said, obviously I can be shocked. Then he proceeded to explain. He said, I asked the reporter to ask me, what have you done for Hindus? वो भी पूछ लीजिए ना. And he asked him. He said, कुछ नहीं किया हूँ. Hindus को भी कुछ नहीं. Then the reporter was completely confused. And I was also confused. I said, I was looking for what he'll say. And he said, see, I am the Chief Minister of Gujarat. I don't work for Muslims. I don't work for Hindus. I work for the residents of my state, Gujarat. The Gujaratis is what I work for. And he said, that's how I lived my life. That's how I do it. Today, I'm the Prime Minister of India. If you can point out one single program which is discriminated and said this is to be anti-Muslim, this is going to be anti-Hindu, or whichever religion, it doesn't have to be anything, then you have to tell me that I'm not doing something for them or taking away something from them. Any scheme, any program of the nation, you can analyze it. You challenge me as a researcher, you can analyze it. And if you find discrimination, then you can spot it and tell me. But I can tell you, I have never distinguished. For me, everybody is an Indian. Now, the politics of it, getting votes, etc. It's a different role people play, including he plays a role as a politician. But I can say with conviction, in his role as Prime Minister, I have never found an incident where I can say he being discriminatory. I have never found a situation where he says democracy or secularism are not values he cherishes. In fact, the narrative created funnily in this country, and the reason why he is possibly, I don't know, I'm not a politics analyst, or I don't analyze politics, that's not my strength. I can only comment as any other commentator in the country today, is that the myth created that the constitution is going to be amended and that's why you need 400 seats. I could not see any evidence in my interaction of any such intent. And if you actually look at data, if you look at the number of times president's rule has been imposed in any state, or the kind of violations of the constitution or amendments to the constitution, more than 100 amendments in this country have all been Congress prime ministers. And so more than 25 times emergency being, the states being superseded, taken as a president's rule, has only been other regimes. Emergency was declared only during the Congress rule. So it's very difficult. And that's all data, right? So I would not take sides today. I would only look at, does the data today point out to gross discrimination of any kind that is evidentially provable? Then we have to take notice. But today's social media world, I have written a book. I've had friends asking me, "Are you a sycophant? Did you write it for any benefit you will get?" I'm already in a position. I don't need any position. And I always tell people, great adage of first read the book by what is inside. Don't judge it by the cover alone, right? And then if you can intellectually point out to me and prove to me, I'll change. I'm an academic. I will be more than happy to revise my opinion. But if you can't, just don't go carried away by an opinion and tell me what to do. Give me substantiative stuff which I can reflect on, and then I can form an inclusive change in my own mind. But today's social media, if you see the post, a few days ago, I met the Prime Minister and gave him a copy of the book. And, he's a Prime Minister of the country. I took a signature on the book, and I was privileged that he even tweeted about it. He put it on his social media posts, etc. And millions of people have seen. Thousands have appreciated it. One or two in the middle will say they've neither read the book nor know me at all. I'm not a known person at all. Just because the Prime Minister, you have an opinion, you write something. So people don't understand that today we are where fake has become more real than real. And none of us have the courage to separate. Right? No, we all have to do that. Otherwise, we can't make this world a better place. How do we really go beyond the ordinary narrative? And that's why I like the structure of your podcast. If you can't see the public narrative and align it, so you may have a different public narrative, but somewhere can we see the commonness of a public narratives? Your public narrative could be developing your country, my public narrative could be developing my country. It doesn't have to be at the cost of each other's country. How can I see how do we shape our public narratives together so both countries can develop? I think unless we take that stand and really discover what can bring us together, rather than try to search for what can separate us, I think we'll always have these suspicions, these doubts, etc. For me, my discovery is trying to see what can bring us together.
So, I think what has helped is the fact that we've known each other. I've been in classrooms with you, and I respect you, and I know you'll be intellectually rigorous and objective with your analysis, and that we'll have a very robust and discussion on this matter. And thank you very much for being part of that. And I think it's been a fascinating discussion. So, my question to you next is: let's say if Prime Minister Modi is successful, how does Pakistan end up being better? How does Bangladesh end up being better? How does Sri Lanka end up being better? Because that's the fear that, it's the rise of India could mean a loss for other countries who in whatever sphere, cultural, economic, security. But how do you, looking at Arjuna and Bhagavad Gita or Vivekananda's teaching and now Prime Minister Modi's, how do you put and give comfort and also hope to other countries that India's rise, peaceful rise or otherwise, is going to be beneficial to other nations?
So I think first you got to go deep and ask ourselves why somebody's rise troubling us, right? I would ask a simple question. If somebody is rising only because to rule over the neighbors, then that's a real troubling situation. All of us have to worry about it. Whether it's China or India, the United States builds a narrative of China's growth can be a problem, so I have to support India. And we all build our own See, finally, international diplomacy is all about self-serving ideologies and ideas. But India's philosophy of change has always been Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, making the whole world a better place. In reality, India cannot progress if there is no peace in its neighborhood. Let's be realistic. If we don't have a win-win model, neither can Pakistan prosper. So it's if we have to fight poverty in both our nations, which India substantially fought. Today, our poverty levels are close to 10 to 12%. From 36%, we come down substantially, and acute poverty is less than 2-3% today. And that's a model for Pakistan to learn from. If we can't do sharing and caring in our neighborhood, and I can say the spirit, the civilizational connect that we all have as nations, whether it's Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, we are all part of one larger geographical entity. Now, let's not the idea is not to redraw geographies today. We are all unique countries, independent countries on our own. Can we try to say, how can we discover what is common between us? Culturally, there's so many things common. Like historically, there's so many things common. Politically, there's so many things common. So the more our countrymen and nations are willing to actually test out the realities that exist and not get shaped by the narratives that get fed to us. And we all get carried away by narratives. Every nation has got a set of problem makers who fashion narratives. They get their existence and identity by talking anti-India in Pakistan or maybe anti-Pakistan in India. And we have to keep it aside and say, for once, can we begin this relationship on trust? Can Pakistan or Bangladesh is increasingly trusting now, trusting and say that, in India's progress and welfare lies prosperity for the region also. India also will grow up and say, I'm not wanting to be a big brother. All I want to is to be a helping hand when you need it. So if I can ensure that the individuality of countries in the neighborhood are protected, without trying to play big brother and say, if I don't behave like the West and say homogenization is the only solution, and you have to take my model. I have success stories. I'm willing to share. I'm willing to help. I'm willing to stand in. Like Sri Lanka was pulled out of their economic mess because India helped them. Right? They would have been the way they would have drowned themselves is messy. So and you help them when they ask for it, you give. You don't look for. If Pakistan has a flood, India offered support. No, political reasons it might not have been taken, etc. Turkey and India are not the best of friends. And Turkey had an earthquake. You don't ask politically, do I go help you? It's human beings out there who are suffering. Humanitarian need is global. I go support it. So I think look at those kind of data also, where the intent is to work together. And if we start crafting that narrative from both sides, it's a two-way street. I don't think India alone can walk the street, nor can Pakistan alone walk the street. We both walk together. We start walking towards each other, not away from each other. Today, there is a political expediency, there's a political necessity to demonstrate that walking away. That was to great extent the olive branch was. End of the day, Prime Minister flew in for an informal visit to your Prime Minister's family wedding. Right? It
From
unthinkable.
Avanti.
Yeah.
From Avanti. Yes, he would.
Unthinkable in the diplomatic circles. The Minister of External Affairs must have been petrified. You can't just do what you want. You have to go through proper ways, right? So we have to send out signals like that we mean business. We have to be there for each other to show that we'll take care of each other. I think I can say this much as a proud Indian. I'm not representing my government in this podcast. As a proud citizen of India, India's civilizational convictions and beliefs are sharing and caring in the spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is what this government is trying to fashion as its international narrative. No, it's not. Yoga is not Indian. We say yoga is for the whole world. Wellness thinking in Ayurveda is not Indian for us. It's for the whole world. If you're better and healthy, everybody benefits. If you make a vaccine, which India is considered the vaccine factory of the world, it's meant for the whole world. It's not just for you and me. And if we start believing in it and start trusting each other and working together, I think we can shape an economic narrative. In a jocular way, if I were to say, if Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka together form one cricket team, we can pretty well beat everybody else in the world, right? We don't even have to say, we don't have to fight each other on the playing pitch. We'll be possibly the strongest team in the world. And I think that way, the global South strength should be shaped with a new thinking of togetherness, interconnectedness, and the conviction that we may not agree with a lot of things. It's fine. Agree to disagree and move on, but trust each other. It'll take a long time. We've had a past which is not easy to trust, to transcend and go beyond it. That's what is leadership all about. Leadership, whether it's for my country or your country, is to transcend this and see the oneness and the purpose of oneness that we need to find a common enemy called poverty, and which we fight together. Find a common enemy called fragmentation and separatism, and fight it, and find the togetherness in I would say in an emotional, social, cultural way. And I think that's what matters. That's why I would look at it. That's the only way peace can come.
The leadership model that I've seen that work and being very effective. My mother, who's eldest of the family, 84 years old, I found her that she is someone who's very patient, also someone who compromises. And a lot of times I have a lot of problem with her. I said, why are the first one who calls? Why are you the first one who goes and tries to make up and tries to bring people together? You're not getting the right respect. You're not getting the right stature. And she said, because I'm the eldest of the family. and over a period of time, what I've realized is, okay, sometimes you can't force people, particularly your sisters, younger brothers and sisters. And I think just by being there and being supportive and by being loving and by compromising and the one who brings everyone together, people automatically come to you and people bestow you the leadership. They give you to be the leader. The question then is that can India play that role? Can Prime Minister Modi can play that role, which is a big brother, a big-hearted, the forgiving, the generous elder brother of the region to bring everyone together, because that's the kind of leadership is needed. You give the example of cricket, but the cricket model in the Indian model is not very hopeful in that sense, is because where BCCI is seen is highly dominating and having its way. So can Prime Minister Modi, and by the way, Prime Minister Vajpayee was seen as someone who was very generous, and although he had the BJP background, but was of course a statesman-like. So can Prime Minister Modi, from the book and the reading, and can India play that role of being the generous and forgiving power in this region to bring everyone together?
I fully think so. With conviction, I'm answering this, and with responsibility, I'm answering. Like I said, this is my personal answer. I'm not taking sides or defending anybody or advocating anybody's cause. I truly think that it's necessary first, and India is the only one which can play it, because you should be practical also. The size of our economy, the size of the country, the strength that we have in every sense of the word,
Culture,
that
everything.
everything, right? And so and culturally, we are always been an absorbing culture. If you look at India, and we could have the Parsis come in, the Jews come in, the Muslims come in, everybody could come from Iran to Israel, and they were welcomed and taken care of. And I think every nation has its growth story, every nation has its ups and downs. But if you look at it truly, the spirit of wanting to discover that space of leadership, wanting to discover the space of unification, I can say this is India's moment. And not just India's moment, the South Asia's moment. This is a moment for the global South. And my belief and conviction is Prime Minister Modi has got that acceptance as a global leader today in whichever fora that he goes to create that narrative, strengthen it, shape it, and possibly leave behind as his legacy. In fact, the book's title is Power Within, the Leadership Legacy of Narendra Modi. And I think this expression of that large hearted, kind, compassionate, empathetic person, which I have seen him in my research 30 years, is what I would, maybe 3 years or 5 years later, you and I should have this discussion again to see whether my understanding is right. I'm convinced it's right. So let's only time can tell us this. And I hope and I would like to see that happen. And I'm sure it is the beginning of the change.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, Dr. Balu, and it was my pleasure to go through in depth, both into your personal life, your personal psychology, consciousness, in a way, because that's what one needs to understand your book, is to understand you. Any parting thoughts, any thing that you would like to state about both your personal life and well as the book, and what it represents for people of India, for it represents the people of South Asia, and also the world?
I think I would only simplistically say this. Finally, the legacy that we can all leave behind is not the stories we create, the buildings we build, or the money we make. The real lasting legacy that we can all leave behind is the legacy of discovering ourselves in the service of others. And to do this, we have to transcend pettiness of our own inner thinking, pettiness of our responses to the world outside. We trust rather than holding the others to become trusted. And somewhere we need to take the first step. And you said it so beautifully. Can we take the first step and be large-hearted? I think the model that South Asia has got an opportunity today is not just for leadership, but culturally, our models has always been driven by compassionate capitalism. Our models have always been driven by communitization, not individualization. Our models have always been driven by the other rather than ourselves. Our models have been driven by unifying rather than separating. So if we can discover those sweet spots, I think together we can all make this world a better place. Because at the end of the day, there is no separation. There is no you and I. All these are illusory models that we have created for our own petty benefits. Real selflessness is transcending these personal, egoistic demands that we make of ourselves and each other, transcending it, seeing that space of divinity in the other. And the worship of the divinity is developing this kind of a compassionate society that not only we can be proud of, but can become the true legacy that we can leave behind for future generations. So, leaving up to generating this four P's, that truly is a declaration for the world. It's not a declaration for one country or just for G20 nations that happen in Delhi. How do we all work together in this spirit of partnership, of creating, investing on peoples of all our countries, creating the profits that can sustain the economic models and demands of the world today, making sure the balance of ecology and economy happens in concern and care for the planet as much as we care for ourselves. And finally, saying that without peace, there's going to be nobody to enjoy peace. And if we can do that, that's a real legacy we leave behind. And I hope that in my lifetime and in our generation, this would be achieved around the world. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jalal, for having me. I know 2 hours have just flown by. I was just looking at the time. I never realized it. The thought that came to my mind is I enjoyed speaking for 2 hours, but who are the audience who's going to enjoy listening to both of us for 2 hours? But it was fun.
Well, to me, it's an intellectual repository of knowledge and wisdom that I'm trying to do, and people can take it for 5 minutes or even 2 hours. I think it's to go into depth into that. That's the nature. You can't go about transformation without going into depth. The depth that you went into your tribal families and the people that you touch with, into your own consciousness, into your own motives, into your own mind, into your own hands to bring about change. And so I think this was a fascinating discussion, and it talked a lot about selfless devotion, purpose in life, also action, but also duality. Duality is an important aspect of, that was in Bhagavad Gita, is to see the other, the oneness of the universe, the oneness of human experience is that I'm living my experience through you as the other person. And I think if we can have that, we can have more inclusive growth, more inclusive economic prosperity, and peace, profits, planet, and what was the other fourth one? The oneness of people, the oneness of planet, the oneness of the profit, as well as peace, that we can achieve more. So thank you very much for another episode of the Transformation and Alchemy of Transformation, and for joining us for this very interesting discussion. Please subscribe to the channel, the Alchemy of Transformation, on YouTube and on LinkedIn. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to Dr. Balu Subramaniam for this very engaging, very open, very objective discussion. We will have subsequent follow-on with Dr. Balu, because he has such a wealth of knowledge on transformation of public sector through the role that he's doing that. But for now, thank you and it's over from the Alchemy of Transformation.